So I think when I talk to my family about better regulation, they don't really understand what I'm talking about, what my job is. What I try to explain to them, though, is that better regulation is not something for lawyers and politicians. It's something that affects individuals, all citizens in their daily life. And that's why it is something that we must all take very seriously.
To strengthen the awareness for better regulation in Eastern Europe, an international conference on this topic was held in the Georgian capital Tbilisi in October 2011. More than 80 lawyers, scientists, and civil servants from 13 countries shared their ideas and experiences in the plenum and 3 panels. They were invited by the Ministry of Justice of Georgia, the German Agency for International Cooperation, the German Foundation for International Legal Cooperation, and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. At the beginning, there was a practical example from Slovenia about the relationship between winter tires and regulatory impact assessment. A small public administration got the task to draft a new law on road security, taking into account the EU directive on winter tires.
Not obligatory at that time in our country to use RIAs for bylaws. And when we were drafting, we just said, we have approximately 1 million cars and we have to replace 4 winter tires starting in 2 months period. It means that on the market immediately will appear 4 million tires. So we have one producer of tires in the country. So do anybody contact them? Do anybody contact importers? What is with the stores, with the shops of winter tires? Are they ready for that? Because the agenda was on our working plan that bylaws should start in 2 months period. So winter was closing. What about environment, asked the colleague. I mean, what we will do with a couple of millions winter tires under the old regime, which are on the cars but should be replaced? Well, we were joking, but I don't know. I mean, forests, rivers, firing them, I mean, no, it not go. So is our ministry ready for environment? I don't know. So we come to the following solution. There are great problems connected with environmental issues, import, producer, sellers, services, vulcanizers, these guys who change all that, nobody's informed. Plus, changing 4 winter tires will affect social status of families. So, because one winter tire costs approximately between 70 and 100 euros. So to change all 4, it will be 300 to 400 euros. And will significantly has impact on the social policy and families and all that. So we put that in one section and inform the ministry and the chancellery, and it propose vacatio legis of 1 year, or that this law goes into procedure, this bylaw next year.
There are so many highly experienced lawyers in all parliaments and ministries. Why is it necessary to give them additional support in lawmaking? Isn't it their ordinary job?
The danger with lawyers is that they think they know the answers. And I think it is very useful to remind them that there are more questions perhaps than they are aware of. It's very useful in manuals and other means like this to encourage them to think more broadly about the problems that laws will cause. The danger is that lawyers will see laws as solutions rather than problems. So we have to encourage them also to be aware of the problems that their laws can cause.
How could better regulation be achieved? First of all, we have to curb law inflation. If it is not necessary to make a law, it is necessary to make no law. The maxim is very often disregarded. This can be done by deregulation and debureaucratization. Bill has been working in Brussels on that issue for a couple of years. And Bill, I have to admit that bureaucracy has improved a little bit. Second, we should take measures to improve the quality of legislation and strive for better legislation. Quality of legislation depends also on the quality of legislative drafting and the implementing the law, procedural quality of drafting, formal quality of the product, its substantive quality, and the cost of implementation and enforcement. Participation of the people in agenda setting of government is an essential element of the development and maintenance of rule of law. This issue lies at the heart of democracy. Participation strengthens rights and freedoms. Participatory rights include more than just the right to vote at elections. The people are sovereign, and the structure of every decision-making process should be bottom-up rather than top-down.
A common translation of better regulation is less regulation.
This is not only about skipping existing regulation. Mostly it is about making the existing regulation more efficient. So you don't necessarily have to abolish everything. You just make it more efficient, less costly for businesses to deal with, more understandable for businesses or citizens who have to comply with it, and make it more easy for them to handle the legislation instead of just cutting everything. We have a lot of things to deal with, and even if you have managed to review existing legislation and then you would do nothing for 5 years, you have to start all over again because situations change, new legislation comes up, technologies advance, so you constantly have to review your existing legislation in order to make sure that it's the best legislation possible.
Simplifying law is not a topic just for Western states. It's been on the agenda for some East European countries for a few years as well.
We've had a great chance of having so huge public support which allowed to implement very radical reforms. As a result, now we do have less regulation in terms of less licenses and permits. If I can just name the numbers of approximately 200 permits and licenses, now we have 67, and we have had 21 different types of taxes, while now it is only 6 kind of taxes. But at the same time, we already feel what was the effect of those reforms to the ordinary business of the Georgian citizens, Georgian companies.
Is there an awareness for better regulation in Albania? And if so, where does it come from?
Yes, there certainly is an awareness that regulation should be improved. It comes from many different sources. We've been speaking at this conference about political will. I think many of us have been impressed by how much political will there is in Georgia to do things, and we see that this results in things really happening. In Albania, a lot of the people pushing for change are foreign projects, and that goes more slowly because everything has to be translated literally and figuratively into the will of the Albanian people and the government. I've just finished a 5-year EU project inside the Albanian Ministry of Justice, and I know how hard people work. Albania has similar problems to countries of this region: high staff turnover, low salaries. Those obviously decrease motivation, but we have found many good counterparts to work with in Albania, and they have a real desire to do something, I think. That's why it's a pleasure to help.
In Armenia, where did the political will to start the process of better regulation come from? Why did the government pay attention to this question?
It's a practical need, which there is no way around. During all these years during the decade of independence in Armenia, we feel that we have no way around than to have better regulations in place. Otherwise, we have laws and very frequent common amendments in these laws during the year even where the law is adopted by the parliament. So better regulations are an urgent need if we want to have an efficient government, efficient governance, and the and prudent, well-considered lawmaking. Otherwise, this affects also the evaluation of the productivity of the government, the evaluation of good governance.
Is it possible that the same law that is in force maybe in Poland and in Bulgaria is a good one in Poland and a bad one in Bulgaria?
Definitely, that happens very often. And it was Montesquieu who said many years ago that laws are so designed for the particular culture for which they are created that it would be most unusual if they actually suited another country, another legal system. And this is because each system is different, and it is the specifics of the system that must be taken into account by each law. And so it is most unusual that we can actually take a law from one system and adopt it just as it stands. On the other hand, we can use it for inspiration. We can look at it and say, well, certain features in that are useful, but we must adapt them to our system.
But isn't it possible to know if a law act is good or bad before it comes into force?
As part of my job in Brussels, we used to look at the drafts of legislation that were passing through the system, and we had to put ourselves in the shoes of the citizen to try to imagine the sort of problems that would arise with that law if it were adopted. And so, to a certain extent, it was the job of people checking these laws to ask the same questions that citizens would ask, to say, how will this affect me? How will this affect someone in this position? We had to have a vivid imagination to try to see the possible problems that an act might give rise to.
How did you manage this information process?
To avoid such problems in an early stage of lawmaking in Germany, a close cooperation between parliament and government was established that involves an independent regulatory control council.
The principles of better regulations are part of the joint rules of procedures of the federal ministries, and the Court of Auditors checked in the 16th legislature period if these principles are really obeyed, and they felt that there was some room for improvement. So the result of this report of the Court of Auditors was that the Act for the implementation of a regulatory control council was amended with 2 or 3 of these principles, and the council is now allowed to examine these principles as well. So this is very helpful to bring these principles into the real political life, into the process of lawmaking.
Does it mean it's not enough to bring in the ideas of better regulation into the laboratories of the ministries?
Regulation partly is a product of the experts in the ministries and in the field of society which is interested in the legislation. On the other hand, the law is a product of parliament, and parliament consists of politicians as we and others. And my feeling is that by, improving the rule of law state, you could establish very good drafting offices in ministries, in the office of the prime minister and so on. So the drafts which reach the parliament sometimes are very good. But then if they come into the hands of the politicians, they sometimes deteriorate. And I think you could improve institutions by learning from other countries, but it's very difficult to improve politicians because politicians are a cross-selection of the people, and politicians are not better and are not worse than the average people on the road.
Such act on the regulation for every 6 months, so you can imagine.
The common benchmark for lawmaking in transition countries nowadays is the law of the European Union. In many EU member states, this process of lawmaking is under fire. It is harshly criticized as undemocratic and untransparent. How should transition countries deal with this contradiction?
Next slide, please.
It's certainly true that whatever efforts the EU makes to make its legislative process more transparent, it is very hard for it to communicate with 500 million citizens, which it has now. I think transition countries have advantages in that they are smaller. They have in many ways more modern modern systems in place. They do not have to deal with a system that has been growing up over 50 years and has perhaps some illogical bases in it. Transition countries can design a system from scratch that avoids some of the problems of the EU system, and perhaps by virtue of their small scale, that they can communicate directly with citizens, businesses, and ensure that the laws they adopt will not just be acceptable, but will actually be followed by users.
Should smaller countries like Kosovo place growing emphasis on their own way of legislation rather than look towards EU standards?
The way, the path should be clear towards EU, towards Brussels, but the steps should be smaller, a lot smaller, with putting the stress on the actual situation in the respective country. And I miss this effort very often, meaning that I'm very often confronted with laws that absolutely do not fit within the regulatory field, within the regulatory surroundings. And that's the reason why I often think that smaller steps are much more helpful than the big view towards Western Europe, towards the European Union.
Anyway, in many transition countries you can hear, our law shall meet Western standards. Are there uniform Western standards in lawmaking at all?
I don't think there are single unitary standards. On the hand, there are certain trends. I think that the trend towards transparency, the trend towards accessibility to citizens, the trend to avoid imposing excessive burden on businesses, all these are useful trends that we can all take inspiration from. But I don't think that any Western country would actually say we have got an ideal system. They would all say we are trying to move in a certain direction. I don't think anyone believes that they have reached that destination. And I think the same must apply for transition countries. We are all looking in the same direction, but different people are at different stages on that journey.
International and national organizations can support this process. In Armenia, for example, the German International Cooperation, GIZ, is a long-term partner of the Ministry of Justice.
We have had a very successful cooperation in the field of administrative procedure, and now we're having that in the field of criminal procedure, notarial system in Armenia, and we envisage further cooperation in various other aspects. And also we have, at this very moment, we have intensive works going on, elaboration of a legislative handbook for Armenia, again through the assistance of GIZ expert and GIZ local staff, with drafting actually the legislative handbook, which should be later presented to the government for approval. And it's a very clear example of productive work between the ministry and GIZ, where we can see the outcomes, we can see the results of this cooperation on paper, in practice, and we can feel these results.
GIZ is working since over 10 years in the Caucasus to support the legal and judicial reforms here. With this conference, we try to share our experience, which we made in Germany with our handbook on legal drafting, and to bring in other experience from other countries, from Eastern Europe countries, as well as from West European countries in legal drafting. We think we can offer a lot of experience, a lot of positive best examples, and give support to the drafting processes in the 3 South Caucasus countries.
The founding fathers of the United States Constitution in 1787 said, "Let us be guided by experience, because reason might mislead us." Which experiences of the common people should be taken into account?
I know, and perhaps we'll discuss at our panel, that Moldova has an experience of corruption-proofing legislation. In other words, to reduce corruption by making certain changes in legislation. And some people from Moldova have come to Albania. I've met them there, and they've been working on this, but I'm a little bit dubious. I mean, it doesn't really make too much difference whether you change the legislation. Obviously, clear legislation it's harder to have corrupt affairs when legislation is clear. But more than that, I think people want to see laws really enforced. And when they see laws not being enforced, violated freely by some people, their faith in the law is destroyed, and it doesn't matter how good the law is. So better regulation, in my view, is really a part of a whole societal change and concept and political leadership, really. Although my part of it is only the technical legislative drafting.
Sometimes it seems better regulation is something like a political fashion. Is it just that?
I'm sure there are some politicians who just regard it as something, a cause that they can take up for a short time and then they can pass on to the next cause. But it's more important than that. I think better regulation is something that cannot just be dealt with for a short time and then overlooked. It is something that we must keep at the forefront of our activities throughout the period of our administration.
Now the conference comes to an end. Will you go to your supervisor on Monday and demand, let's make better regulations?
Of course, we plan to use this kind of experiences, this kind of practices, and I think we will initiate these questions to use such practices in our legislation, in our work as well.
I concur with my colleague. On Monday, I will report to my supervisor about the conference, especially about legal harmonization, the topic of today's morning session. The question of how to harmonize Azerbaijani and European law is currently an important one for our country.